This is my favorite part of anatomy, which is the brain and the cranial nerves. I like the whole nervous system, but specifically I love the brain stuff. This takes a little while to get through, probably has a decent amount of unfamiliar terminology. So be patient and kind with yourself and make sure that you give yourself quite a bit of time to study. So first thing that we're going to start out with before we get to the brain is all of the multiple layers of protection that are around the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. So this rather strange and maybe disturbing picture is really kind of showing you the layers of protection around the brain and the spinal cord. The very first layer of protection around the brain and the spinal cord is this really thick cranium, the skull, and then of course also the vertebral column that we'll put. So of course the spinal cord is encased in bone mostly, and then the brain is encased in a relatively thick layer of compact bone with spongy bone in the middle. And then the brain and the spinal cord also have their own layers of membranes that are unique to the central nervous system called meninges. The singular for the word is meninx, M-E-N-I-N-X. So the meninges collectively are the second line of protection, and what they really are is three connective tissue layers around the brain, and then there are some layers, some spaces in between them. So as you move out from the brain, you have on the surface of the brain, I'll draw these for you in just a second, a layer called the pia mater, and then you have the arachnoid, and then you have the dura mater. And the dura mater has a couple of different layers depending on whether you're around the brain or the spinal cord. So let me just draw you like a bad picture of the layers around the brain and the spinal cord, and then we'll learn about them specifically. So let's just go to a whiteboard picture for just a second. And so this is a very, very poorly drawn picture of the brain, which is continuous with the spinal cord. And there are layers of protection around the brain, and we're going to label each one of them. Let's do the one that is closest to the brain. It's actually stuck to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord, but it's a little hard to draw it that way. So I want you to know that this red layer is actually on the surface of the brain and the spinal cord, and it is called the pia mater, which means gentle mother. And then superficial to the pia mater, let's get another layer in there. There's going to be another layer that is superficial to the pia mater, again continuous around the brain and the spinal cord. And that one is called the arachnoid, as in spider. And some textbooks call it the arachnoid mater, which would be the spider mother, and some just call it the arachnoid. And then there is one superficial, really, really thick layer, and that one is called the dura mater. And it goes all the way around the brain and the spinal cord as well. This is the dura mater. And dura mater means tough mother. So we have from superficial to deep, the tough mother, the spider mother, and then the gentle mother. But there are also spaces in between each of these layers. So let's start from the outside in this time and talk about, okay, let's do all of the spaces in yellow. So if we go around the outside of the dura mater, superficial to the dura mater, but only around the spinal cord for reasons we'll describe in just a second. What we have here is the epidural space. Epi meaning on or upon the dura, okay? And then we run into the dura mater, and then deep to the dura mater between the dura and the arachnoid is the subdural space. Okay, then we run into the arachnoid, and let's say within and underneath the arachnoid is the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space. And then we run into the pia mater, and the pia mater is actually stuck to the surface of the brain, so there's no subpial space really. Okay, so we're going to review those as we go through. I just wanted you to know where they were relative to one another. Okay, so the spaces in meninges, like we said, from superficial to deep. If you are around the spinal cord, the first thing you are going to run into is the, hold on, let me find it. The subarachnoid space, and the subarachnoid, I'm sorry, the epidural space. That's what I meant to say. The epidural space. The epidural space is on or on top of the dura. And it is not present in the cranial cavity because we'll see that the dura actually is continuous with the periosteum of the bone in the cranial cavity. But around in the spinal or vertebral cavity, the epidural space is filled with loose connective tissue and fat, which pads the spinal cord. And of course, this is the place that you can enter an epidural injection when you are, for instance, during childbirth, you can do an epidural injection. And what you would want to do is you would want to go, this one is deeper. You would want to go more superficial than this. But between L3 and L4, you would enter just into this, the epidural space right here. This is a lumbar puncture. But if you went the same route and then stopped in this fat around it and you injected an anesthetic, what it would do is it would numb the sensory and motor nerves that were coming out of that region. So it's an epidural anesthetic. And then what you do after the epidural space, whether you are around the brain or the spinal cord, what you're going to run into first is the dura mater. So if we are around the spinal cord, the dura mater is represented right under that fat, kind of in that little purple color that you're seeing right there. Point to it for you. So the dura mater is like right there. Okay, that is the dura mater that you're seeing right there. And then if you are around the brain, let's find a good picture to look at with the dura mater around the brain. Okay, so this one right here starts working our way in with the dura mater from around the brain. So here is the bone and then the periosteum of the bone. That's around both sides. And then please note that the dura mater around the brain actually is going to end up having two layers. So let's find those so that you can see them. So the first layer of the dura mater around the brain is right here, and it's continuous with the periosteum of the bone, and it's called the periosteal layer of the dura mater, and it's around the brain. And then that's why you don't have an epidural space, by the way, because there's really no space between the periosteal layer of the dura mater and the actual bone. And then there's another layer. The second layer you're seeing right here, right? That's the second layer. That's called the meningeal layer of the dura mater. There's two layers. And then in some places, not every place, there are blood vessels that exist between the periosteal and the meningeal layers of the dura mater. And those blood vessels you actually have to learn in lab, and they're called the dural because they're in the dura, dural venous sinuses. So let me show you the dural venous sinuses. And they are, again, right underneath the bone and the periosteum. And they're big veins. Veins actually are taking blood back toward the heart. And a sinus is a wide vessel. So they are dural, as in the dura mater, venous, as in a vein, and sinus as in wide. So let's look at them. First off, let me show you this picture of them because I think it's really cool and it kind of shows you. Yeah. Okay. So this picture, you can see here is the bone itself, and it would have the periosteal layer of the dura mater stuck to it. Here is the meningeal layer of the dura mater. When you take the skull off, the periosteal layer goes with it, and then you can see these blood vessels that were between the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer of the dura mater. So there's that view. Here's another drawing that's showing you these. These big honkers right here are called the dural venous sinuses. And there's a bunch of them. The one that's running right under the sagittal suture is called the superior sagittal sinus. And that's the one that you can see like in this picture because that's where it was cut. That would be the superior sagittal sinus, which is one of the dural venous sinuses. And then there's this figure in your textbook. Now for right now, I'm not going to ask you to know all the dural venous sinuses. They will actually teach them in lab. But for right now, here they are. 1, 2, 3. There's another one right there, but you can't see it on a mid-sagittal section. And then this one right here. Those are big blood vessels. They are draining deoxygenated blood from the brain and also draining cerebrospinal fluid from the brain. So what is the dura mater made of? It is a tough mother. It's primarily made of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's got lots of collagen fibers in it. It is hard to puncture on accident. And if it is intact, you actually can't see the surface of the brain or the spinal cord. In order to see the surface of the brain or the spinal cord, you actually have to pull the dura mater back. Specifically, you have to pull the meningeal layer back because the periosteal layer left with the skull. So that's the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Now, the other thing about the meningeal layer is that when we learn the brain will have a whole bunch of little hills and valleys, but then it'll have a big crevice that goes between the two halves of the cerebrum and a crevice that goes between the two halves of the cerebellum, and then another one that goes between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And in those locations, instead of the dura mater just staying on the outside, the dura mater folds in. That big opaque membrane folds in between the two halves of the cerebrum, between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and between the two halves of the cerebellum, as what we call the cranial dural septa. Let's break that down. Cranial, as in the cranial cavity. Dural, because they're made of dura mater. And septum means partition. Okay? So the cranial dural septa, let me show you where they are. This one right here is the biggest one. This is called the falx cerebri. It separates the two cerebral hemispheres, and when it's intact and still associated with the brain, it attaches to the crista galli of the what bone? Do you remember what bone the crista galli is part of? Try to remember and write it in there. So it's this big partition right there. And then there is a little bitty partition right here that's between the two halves of the cerebellum. And you can see it right here as well, and that's called the falx cerebelli, or cerebelli. And then there's one that goes lateral like this, that actually folds and separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and you can kind of see it right here, and also right here. Not the blood vessel, but the dura mater that's going in there. And that's called the tentorium cerebelli. So 3 basic partitions of dura mater that fold into the brain in 3 different places, called the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli, and the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so we just did epidural space, and then we did the 2 layers of the dura mater around the brain, and only 1 layer of dura mater around the spinal cord. Okay, and now we are moving in from there. So what is inside, underneath the dura mater? Well, we have a teeny tiny little space. It really doesn't have much room in it, but the teeny tiny little space that is below the The dura mater, this space right here that's kind of drawn in this gray color right there, that's the subdural space, okay? And the subdural space is usually contains just a thin film of fluid. There sometimes are blood vessels running through there, but not as many as other places. That's the subdural space. Doesn't usually have as much clinical importance as some other spaces that we're going to run into. And then deep to that, what we are going to run into is the spiderwebby layer. And the spiderwebby layer you can see right here. Oops. And this spiderwebby layer that you see right here is called the arachnoid or the arachnoid mater. Okay, and you can see it labeled right there, the arachnoid or the arachnoid mater. And what it is a whole bunch of collagen fibers reaching down from the bottom layer of the dura mater all the way to the pia mater. It has a space that's kind of within it that's actually called the subarachnoid space. So what's a little confusing, and I'll come back and describe the arachnoid a little bit more in just a second, is all of these fibers that you're seeing right there going through, those are all part of the arachnoid, but the space within them is actually considered the subarachnoid space because there's room for stuff to circulate in here. There's also room for blood vessels to be in there. So the subarachnoid space is actually the intra-arachnoid space, but there's more to the arachnoid than that. The arachnoid, this middle layer, like a hairnet over the brain, has little extensions that poke up into those blood vessels. Remember that this was a blood vessel. This was a blood vessel. And so these are one-way valves called arachnoid villi, or sometimes arachnoid granulations. And they act as one-way valves because the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, circulates in the subarachnoid space, and when it needs to get out and get back into the bloodstream, it will leave via these one-way valves called arachnoid villi. So that's how it actually leaves. So, and then we get to the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is the space within the arachnoid mater, so it's really not subarachnoid. Like I said, it's intra-arachnoid. And what's really important about the subarachnoid space is that that is one of the two primary places where cerebrospinal fluid actually circulates. In addition, there's a whole bunch of blood vessels that are in there that you can see, like right here, blood vessels that are in there. And then we get to the deepest layer, which is kind of drawn in this like purple lining that you see that is just really, it's like stuck to the surface of the brain that you see right here. And it's called the pia mater. And the pia mater really makes the surface of the brain look kind of shiny. There's lots of teeny tiny little blood vessels in the pia mater, and it's really stuck completely there. So if we go back to this figure and say, okay, the pia mater is making the brain shiny, and then this that we're seeing that's spiderwebby is the arachnoid, and then this is one of the layers of the dura mater. And then we'll look at a couple more pictures. So this is the meningeal layer of the dura mater, and then you're kind of seeing a little bit of pia and arachnoid together right there. And then with this one, all you have is pia left, and you're kind of pulling the arachnoid off right there. This is like a live brain surgery in which you can see the spiderwebby arachnoid and also the shiny pia. And they're really kind of continuous with one another, and it's really difficult to pull the pia away from the brain without destroying some of the brain tissue. Okay, so that is all of the layers of protection that are immediately around the brain, except for now we'll get into cerebrospinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. We'll do that one in the next one.